So our last speaker in the session is Max Ghenis, who is the co-founder and CEO of PolicyEngine and the founder and president of the UBI Center, where he conducts fully open source research on UBI and tax policies. Max is going to tell us about PolicyEngineUK, which is an open source app for tax and benefit microsimulation. Go ahead, Max.
Thank you, Carson, and great to be with you all today. So let's see, here we go. Can you folks see my slides?
Yes.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, so really excited to be here. I'll be talking about our work to build PolicyEngineUK, which we launched last year as an open source app for tax and benefit microsimulation. I'm the co-founder of PolicyEngine, which is really a tech nonprofit that aims to empower people to understand and change public policy. And my co-founder, Nikhil Woodruff, is also on the call. So what I thought I'd do is talk about some of the motivation for a product like this and move on to a demo of the Green Party's manifesto in the UK. From there, I'll talk a bit about some of our documentation and validation, I think especially relevant to this audience, and some of our technologies, especially building on Lars's great talk earlier. And then finally, our future plans. So motivation, I mean, I think we all know this innately, but I think it's just worth reiterating that tax and benefits are just an enormous part of the economy. Across the OECD, it represents a third of GDP, and a third of that is spent as cash benefits. And both of those are moving up over time. Also, of course, in developing countries, as countries get richer, they're going to redistribute more. So there's a lot of stakeholders who care about the tax and benefit policy, everyone from voters who ultimately this affects their checkbooks and every month the tax and benefits affect them, to policymakers who are forming the policy and everyone in between, including some of the folks on this call, but also media, the broader education and research organizations, and advocates who want to change those policies. But often there isn't really a shared evidence-based discussion that we can also all look at and know that we're looking at the same numbers. So a brief overview of microsimulation, which kind of fills this gap in many cases. Basically, you have some data on a household, maybe their income and number of kids, and then there's a computer program which calculates their tax liability, benefit eligibility, and as a result, their full net income. Often this is paired with representative survey data, which has some weights. So you do this for all the households in the survey and add that up, and you get some total estimates. This powers a bunch of tax and benefit related studies, everything from New York Times in the US to think tanks in the UK. Basically, anytime you see a distributional analysis, it tends to be from a microsimulation model, sometimes paired with some sort of general equilibrium model as well. And we sort of see a few different stages in terms of how transparent these models can be. So the first thing that all these models are used for is to publish reports like I just shared. These tend to be bespoke analyses of particular policies that are relevant to their audience at that time. And we think the first step toward transparency can be at least publishing aggregates, things that are comparable across lots of different models, comparable to government statistics, so you can see how accurate the model is. From there, you can make the model public, so not just providing it to researchers within your institution, but opening it up. And then open source, of course, is there's lots of layers in between or within open source, but releasing at least the code, and we think developing it as well as in the public version control environment like GitHub is really important. And then we think the final step could be an interactive app so that anyone, regardless of their policy expertise, can engage in this model. Unfortunately, this isn't really how the microsimulation models today work in the UK. So, you've got a couple, there are 6 models in the UK. 2 of them are from the government. 2 are from think tanks. This is a private consulting firm. And then the most recent one is from the University of Essex. And they've taken some steps to publish aggregates. Their model is semi-public. It's not open source. And there is a partial web app that reveals some of their functionality, but everything else really doesn't meet any of these criteria. So we've really started from scratch. We have a model called OpenFiscaUK. OpenFisca is a framework for microsimulation models developed by the French government and used in France and other Francophone countries largely. So we've developed that model to produce the Policy Engine app. And we publish aggregates. It's fully open source on GitHub, et cetera. With that, I'll move over to the app itself. But first, just an overview of the Green Party's manifesto, which is really complicated. So there are a number of different tax reforms that the Green Party has proposed, including repealing a number of taxes, replacing it with kind of funky taxes like a land value tax, a carbon tax, a bunch of benefit repeals as well that turn into a UBI, and also this extra single pensioner supplement, which is not part of the tax and benefit system today. So with that, I'll move to the demo. So this, you're looking now at policyengine.org. If you just go there, it'll take you straight to this page, except this is a sort of a link that's specifically for the Green Party manifesto. And you can see on the right side, this is sort of the cart, the shopping cart of policies. And lots of different policies here. You can scroll through all the provisions. But you can see also that each of them tie to something that's in the tax and benefit system. So you've got your basic rate. This is basically the progressive tax structure, but you can go quite detailed. You can look at Scottish rates have their own particularities. There's lots of pieces of the benefit system. So if you wanted to, let's say, change the disability element of universal credit, we sort of allow very rich flexibility in terms of the policies you can reform. And the next step, once you've designed your policy, and this is sort of pre-built for us, is you can calculate the impact across the UK. So this will calculate the total net cost, poverty, some basic distributional analyses at the top. And we see that the tax revenues rise considerably, but the benefit outlays exceed that. So there's a net deficit as a result. Poverty goes down by 1/3 overall, but it's closer to half for kids. You've also got the change in net income by decile, so it's quite progressive. Also, you can look at absolute versus relative changes. And these are averages within the decile or across the decile, but within each decile, a lot of people have heterogeneous outcomes. So you've got, even in the bottom decile, where on average people come out ahead, some people do come out behind. And this is largely because of the land value tax, which some asset-rich, income-poor people would face. And finally, we've got some inequality measures too. So the Gini index would fall, as would some other inequality measures. So this gives a high-level overview, but let's say you're looking at this and you decide, actually, I really care about budget neutrality. Well, you can actually basically change the policy that the Green Party has proposed. So if you raise the basic rate from 32% to 34%, now you're going to get a budget neutral version sort of right at your fingertips. So the poverty impact falls a bit. It's not quite the 33, it's now 31. But so kind of, you can adjust lots of different policy parameters, including those provided by external institutions. With that, I'm going to, so one other piece of this is you can also calculate the personalized impact. So not just the impact on society, but let's say you're a single parent of 2, and maybe you are 30 years old, and you've got, let's say, income around the median, which is about £30,000 a year. So from here, you can calculate the net income. This is going to calculate both in the baseline scenario and also for this sort of modified Green Party manifesto. So you can see the top level effect is going to be quite positive for this household. Their baseline estimate is, or net income is about 26K, goes up to 32. And this isn't quite going to be accurate because I didn't input any consumption or assets which would affect their carbon tax and land value tax liability. But you can see that for example, they lose these benefits because they're repealed effectively, but they get more back from the UBI. So the net benefit increase is strong, and they do definitely pay more in tax, and the national insurance is kind of rolled into the income tax here. So you can see the full net effect, sort of all the oranges, back to Fernando's presentation. And one more thing you can see as well is how your earnings would affect you. So as you potentially, you might want to change your labor supply as a response to your new income schedule, this is going to show you that. So in this case, their reform income, this is sort of employment income here and net income, it's going to be larger than the larger than the baseline. So this household's going to be better off as long as they don't earn below, let's say, 20K. We also see the marginal tax rate, and just zooming in on the baseline, I think this is often pretty opaque to people, but the folks in the UK, and this is true in the US too, who face the highest marginal tax rates are the poor because of benefit withdrawal. And this sort of makes that clear. It's 69% based on largely the phase out of universal credit. And this extra hump is because child benefit also phases out, and then you've got personal allowance phasing out as well. So the reform kind of levels that out and makes it more consistent across the spectrum. So that is Policy Engine, and I'll move on to a bit of documentation and validation as well. So our model, as I said, is OpenFiscaUK. If you go openfisca.uk, it'll show that. So here, this is actually built on JupyterBook and hosted on GitHub Pages. So it shows you some basic usage of the model. We're all Python, but this is some Python code which will produce a few aggregates across each region. You can also look at specific programs. So child benefit, for example, we show basically as we're cataloging all the parameters that are from the policy, we actually look at the legislative references. So we have this in our sort of metadata files that are behind the scenes. So you can see, okay, we've got for 2007, the amount per week for eldest children was $18.80. We can actually go to the legislation that specifies that. So it's fully open and transparent. And this shows it for every parameter as it changes throughout over time. Again, we can sort of mix documentation with some interesting results, which is like how much would you actually get from child benefit depending on the number of children. This is also OpenFiscaUK code that you can expand and show if you'd like. And then the last thing is we do a lot of validation. So comparing against official estimates and UK mod, which is the only other model that provides aggregates. So we see that we definitely have some ways to go. We're not perfectly accurate, but we're significantly more accurate than the other models. And part of the reason for that is we actually apply a gradient descent algorithm to reweight the survey data. We've done some research that shows that the original survey weights are actually inaccurate. So we can see that in more detail here at the validation page. So this chart shows our relative, we can go 2022, our relative errors, depending on the program, are somewhere from 0% to, this is a pretty small program, but 37%. But that's about between half and 1/20th or so of UK mods. So we know there's more work to do, but feel pretty good. And again, this is fully reproducible as a Jupyter notebook. All right. Want to also talk about some of the technology we use. So we use, as we're fully open source as a product, we use a bunch of open source software ourselves as well. Everything we use is open source pretty much. So Python, OpenFisca is really a critical tool for us, as well as things like JupyterBook and TensorFlow. We have a number of open source packages as well, not just OpenFisca packages, but also SynthCompute, for example, will conduct data fusion using random forest models. We use a bunch of tools for the open source development, including GitHub Actions and Docker, as well as basically every GitHub product out there. A bunch of methodologies as well. So test-driven development, we basically write all the tests first, make sure the tests pass every time we have a new version that comes out. And a lot of this is espoused in the PSL philosophy. So some of our plans, we do actually have a beta US model at policyengine.org/US. So far, there's no macro estimates. We don't have the microdata hooked up yet. But you can actually calculate within California how some benefits are affected by your income. So we're actually working with some folks who are doing guaranteed income pilots because they're concerned how those cash assistance transfers could affect benefit eligibility, and we're able to calculate that. We're also excited to move to other countries, especially developing countries, some of which are already modeled in the OpenFisca system. We also really want to put more economics into the model. So right now it's basically an accounting tool. We want to have labor supply responses, other outcomes. We do have a carbon tax, so you could imagine a carbon emission estimate of the policy reform as well. Different parameters. There's a lot of interesting research on what drives program take-up. So even if you're eligible for a program, doesn't mean you'll participate. And then we're also actually starting to work with Jason and his colleague Rick on getting OG UK. So this would be an overlapping generations dynamic macro model using OpenFisca UK. So you can imagine the web app also serving that at some point. Ultimately, though, what we're most excited about is a more democratic kind of participatory approach to policymaking. So you can imagine an app or just some way on your phone to really easily scroll through all the different policies that, whether it's policymakers or think tanks or just individuals who have put out policy ideas, how that's going to affect you and how it's going to affect society. You could also create policies, of course. And you could drill in and see some of the more details we just looked through, as well as looking through institutions to see the variety of reforms that they've proposed. So coming back to that original question, I think this is really what we're hoping to fill. A lot of times there isn't quite that consistent data layer for the policy conversation, and we hope Policy Engine can fill that void. So thank you very much.
That's awesome. Thanks so much, Max. Yeah, and on that stakeholder slide, first of all, I want that app desperately. I'm for it to be available. What's your perception so far? Like, what kind of take up have you seen among these different stakeholder groups, or have you been testing the model among any of these other groups?
Yeah, so I think the Green Party was a big success for us. We basically worked with them. So they actually have something called Policy Fest, which is an internal conference for exploring their manifesto. And this was basically fully using Policy Engine for their tax benefit side. Liberal Democrats also, partially maybe based on our history with UBI, they have a UBI-centered manifesto as well. So we're starting to have conversations with them and some smaller think tanks. I think there's a number of think tanks that are bigger that can already afford, or they have some history with some other microsimulation model. So they kind of have some inertia, but that second tier of think tanks, we've had some success with too.
Awesome. In the last 4 minutes, do we have any questions for Max or the other panelists? Do the panelists have questions for each other? I feel like there's a lot of interesting overlap here.
I did mention also that, of course, we're part of PSL. We're actually also fiscally sponsored by the PSL Foundation. So really building on PSL's shoulders here in many ways.